Okay, so to start off, exclusionary design refers to places and objects that have been created to keep certain groups and their activities out of sight. So on the slide, I list examples where exclusionary design manifests itself. The thing about exclusionary design is that it can be blatantly obvious or more discreet, controlling how we move through and interact with the urban landscape. Now, why does exclusionary design exist? Exclusionary design results from the belief that signs of disorder must be prevented from ever occurring to stop an individual or group's descent into serious criminal activity. However, through the examples that the other presenters will give, it becomes more apparent that the goal of exclusionary design is not to prevent disorder, but rather to ensure that affluent members of society are not subjected to interacting with it. So to go with the next slide. On this slide, I show three examples of architectural elements that are implemented in a city to prevent a certain group or activity. These images are credited to Julius Christian Schreiner, who conveys that these examples are intended to be exclusionary by the use of barriers around heating vents, by dual spikes on steps, and by obstructions placed under bridges and other covered areas, which are all interventions that prevent the use of public spaces for shelter or rest. Ergo, the built environment is characterized by these physical features that make it difficult for certain individuals, often low income people and people of color, to access certain places. Hopefully, you're seeing the next slide. Um, on the other hand, inclusionary design makes places usable by everyone, regardless of age, ability, and circumstance. It is based on the simple principle that designing for the widest range of people creates better designs and benefits everyone. On the slide, I list a checklist of what an inclusive place feels or looks like. The thing about the inclusive design is that it is best thought of from the earliest stages of design. The later in the design process it is addressed, the fewer the options and the greater the risk that opportunities will be lost. This can lead to a design that fails to meet the needs of the people it's intended for and may result in costly retrofits. Good practice is advanced by learning from existing good examples of inclusive design. It helps to research and experiment to find out what works and to share good design examples and solutions to common challenges. On this slide, I show an example of inclusive design, the Vauxhall Cross interchange. It is designed to accommodate new street level pedestrian crossings and wider pavements. This provided improved pedestrian environment and experience. It also helps to create a safer and more legible streetscape, which accommodated the increased pedestrian activity between Vauxhall Station and Nine Elms in London. The wide footpaths and surface finishes help visually impaired people and wheelchair users as well.
Within the built environment, there may be an idea that public space, as stated in the name, is for everyone, but the reality depicts a much different narrative. In an article by Richard Florida about the inequality of parks and green space, they state that residents with higher levels of education and higher incomes were more likely to have more access to both mixed and woody urban vegetation, and racialized residents were less likely to have access to mixed and woody vegetation in large, dense urban areas. This is significant because research shows that access to green space improves physical and mental health by providing spaces to walk, relax, and play. In turn, it is important for everyone in a city to have access to these benefits, not just the affluent and highly educated. And next slide, please. In a study of Washington, D.C., done by the US Environmental Protection Agency, they found that the locale known as the City of Trees, the trees were not really equally distributed. The district's wealthy neighborhoods had 42% more canopy tree cover compared to the poorest neighborhoods. In the 1990s, the government suffered major budget cuts, resulting in impoverished neighborhoods receiving less funding for tree maintenance, leading to the loss of thousands of trees over time. This disparity of trees is not just an aesthetic manner, but also reveals how people in low-income communities do not get to reap the benefits of trees, from improved air and water quality, shade to cut down cooling and energy usage, and physical and mental health benefits. And next slide, please. This disparity in tree cover and green space is not only an American phenomenon, but also seen in places around the world. In this photo, it depicts an aerial view of Mumbai, India. To the left is a series of one-story slums along the Mithi River that contrast the building to the right, but house corporate headquarters, consulate generals, and the National Stock Exchange. And it is a city of contradictions with the images of extreme wealth and extreme poverty side by side. As you can see, the slums have almost no tree cover or green space, while the more affluent right has an abundance of green space. And next slide, please. The following images by Johnny Miller are a few more examples of green space disparity in different countries, ranging from Brazil, which is in this photo, to the next slide, which shows Tanzania, and lastly, America. So next slide. So this is another global example within Tanzania. And then this next slide. This final image brings us to another example of how the intersection of planning and green space affects a neighborhood. In this image, it depicts the I-75 and I-375 interchange where the historic Black neighborhood Black Bottom in Detroit used to be. The large open fields surrounding the road used to house thousands of Black families, but they're now just empty fields that no one uses. And next slide, please. This following slide is a GIF that indicates a bird's eye image that layers present-day highways over the communities they displace, thus showing the impact of interstate construction on the American urban landscape. The benefits of new development were reaped by the outer suburban areas, while the construction of highways in the inner cities displaced the largely low-income communities. It segregated the neighborhoods, it increased the amount of air and noise pollution, devalued the surrounding properties, and also removed access to jobs for those without a car, further concentrating poverty. And then in the next slide, we'll elaborate more on how exclusionary practices have created barriers of access to individuals without cars.
Thank you, Abby. Further physical barriers to access are seen through the work of Robert Moses, who is a master builder. He set forth specifications for bridge overpasses like the one shown on this image, in this image. And this was at Long Island. These bridge overpasses were designed to hang low. You can see the 10-foot, 4-inch clearance so that 12-foot tall buses in use at the time could not fit under them. According to the source that's being dropped in the chat right now, quote, one consequence was to limit access of racial minorities and low-income groups who often use public transit to Jones Beach, Moses's widely acclaimed public park. Moses made doubly sure of this result by vetoing a proposed extension of the Long Island Railroad to Jones Beach, end quote. Moses's biographer suggests that his decision to favor upper and middle class white people who owned cars at the expense of the poor and African Americans was due to his social class bias and racial prejudice. Today, it remains the case that the majority of people who plan, design, and build our communities and cities lack the diversity of those same communities and cities that they're designing. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Claire. So one concern that has been turning heads for urban planners, public policy experts, and many other professions dealing with zoning ordinances is the term supermarket redlining, which also can be seen as food deserts. So the definition of the supermarket redlining is the act of relocating grocery stores in urban locations to more suburban areas. With this, many residents of low-income neighborhoods struggle with the ability to purchase healthy foods because they don't have access to healthy foods at reasonable prices. And as food deserts have swept across areas of poor urban areas, these households have been forced to purchase cheaper, more affordable foods. And this has resulted in the increased opportunity for these residents to settle on fast foods from convenience stores, corner stores, and fast food restaurants. And this provides an easier access to processed foods in urban areas significantly more than in suburban areas. And of course, supermarket redlining brings up the issue of unequal opportunities to sustaining a healthy lifestyle. And so in the diagram on the right-hand side, you can see SNAP enrollment. And so SNAP stands for the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, formerly known as food stamps. And so on the right-hand side, you can see the SNAP enrollment is prevalent in areas that large supermarkets are not located at, and where convenience stores are more prevalent at. And with this disparity, in areas that need these food stamps, there's not supermarkets available to them to purchase these healthy, readily available foods. Next slide, please. So according to the USDA, or the United States Department of Agriculture, 1 in every 4 Atlantans live in neighborhoods defined as food deserts. And in urban areas such as this one of Atlanta, food deserts are defined as census tracts. And this means that this population is 1 mile or more away from supermarkets where they can have this accessibility to healthy foods. And here in this diagram, you can see that the food insecurity rates in this area near the metro is where residents are disproportionately affected as people of color and of households of low income. And so with studies from Chicago and with studies from Detroit and Atlanta, you can see that there's unequal access to supermarkets where people can access that healthy food and sustain a lifestyle that is most sustainable for them. And the reason behind this is because challenges in infrastructure, investment, and politics arise when there are large grocery chains in these inner urban areas. And this can be a result of gentrification, which we know as the act of higher income households moving into lower income neighborhoods and essentially pushing out that low income neighborhoods as the property value increases. And this can also be an effect of urban sprawl, which is the expansion of cities away from central urban areas into expansive, low density, car dependent suburbs. And the solution behind this is to support initiatives to help bring fresher foods into these inner city urban areas. And this includes efforts of supporting small businesses and medium businesses to increase their stock of fresh foods in these stores. And this can be seen through the Food Trust of Philadelphia in their Healthy Corner Store initiative. Next slide, please. And that brings us to the next point of the Housing Act of 1934. And so this act created the Federal Housing Administration, which is also known as the FHA. And this helped many Americans with their housing situation and stabilized the housing market during the Great Depression. Unfortunately, during this time, the FHA adopted a new appraisal methodology which assigned grades to neighborhoods based on a variety of factors. One of them strongly weighted the factor of race and ethnicity in the households living in the area. And as a result, they created the residential security maps, which evaluated neighborhoods and placed low ratings on areas that were considered hazardous for loans and banks to give lends to, such through like mortgages. And if they did give out mortgages or provide loans, they did this with a higher interest rates for them. And unfortunately, this affected certain minorities that lived in the area or moved into the area because their ratings would now be subjected to lower ratings. And ethnicities that were considered risky groups were of Mexican descent, African American, and Jewish. And this redlining was directly incorporated into standard practices in the real estate industry. And unfortunately, this presence of ethnic groups was associated with the decline in property value. And of course, this did not continue in the 1960s. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 put a stop to this, but the effect still continues today because of the economic and racial segregation that happened. 74%, in fact, of neighborhoods that were redlined in the 1930s are still low to moderate income neighborhoods today. Next slide, please.
Alrighty, so now I'm going to talk about the concept of modifying our curriculum to be inclusive rather than exclusive. First, I'll discuss a case study by professors of an East Coast university that addresses this concept of incorporating inclusivity into their curriculum. And you'll hear some important things to consider on the curriculum development side of things. Next slide, please. So there's going to be a little link in the chat if you're interested in any of this information, and please feel free to check it out. It's a great resource. But in an American Society of Engineering Education paper, faculty from Rowan University in New Jersey explored means of developing inclusive curriculum in their civil engineering department. This study recognizes the broader impact of education, which goes beyond acquiring technical knowledge and includes navigating the social and emotional elements of higher education. So it really takes a holistic approach to inclusivity. As the study states, quote, students who are not able to develop an alignment in a given discipline in higher education may change majors or drop out to seek a sense of belonging elsewhere. So this applies to more than just engineering students. Think about the experience that you've had in your major or profession, regardless of what it is, and the people that are involved. Have you or do you know someone who has changed paths because you don't have a relatable support system, or maybe you face microaggressions or other forms of discrimination from peers or supervisors? One way to address this is by surveying students, faculty, and staff to assess the inclusiveness of any given program. Their civil engineering department used the Benchmarks for Cultural Change survey to accomplish this. This was created by a different group, and they adapted it for what was appropriate for them. They suggest adapting the survey to inclusion of all underrepresented groups and conducting it once before and once after any adjustments are made. So maybe multiple, it may end up being multiple times. The goal of this is just to create a benchmark of, where is our program for as far as inclusive practices goes. Other methods discussed in this study include setting the tone on the first day of class, just letting people know this is an inclusive space and defining what that means. Carefully crafting introductory courses to be inclusive, and there's lots of other examples for future work. They included a few specific course and activity examples for those interested. They're included in the study. Examples in their technical and structural analysis classes were curated of noteworthy buildings or structural elements from different times and cultures so that students can have an opportunity to be critical about how their knowledge can be applied. As you move forward, consider how well your courses have met certain benchmarks of inclusivity and how this can evolve. Next slide, please. So consider the examples of exclusionary practices that have been presented to you in the last 15 or so minutes. Have you learned about any of those concepts before this presentation, especially if they're relevant to your field of study? And where did you learn those? Is that information that you sought out, or were you presented that in your coursework or in your profession? While some instances were specific to the United States in this presentation, others took place around the world. And that reminds me of one reason that the Unlearning series was created, to challenge our education. Let's think about how we can change it too. So there are lots of creative ways to incorporate DEI concepts into curricula. As I mentioned before, there's those other different concepts explored by that study, and lots of other people are considering this as well, even here at Cal Poly. So some efforts have been made within different departments of the College of Architecture and Environmental Design, but there's certainly a lot more work to be done. From architectural design to structural codes and manuals, there have undoubtedly been significant contributions by people from many different regions. But, and maybe this is something you can talk about in your focus groups, examples, for some reason, we're primarily taught with examples that are from within the United States or other primarily European cultures. Western European cultures. So this leads to many people either forgetting or not recognizing and realizing that contributions are made by people globally, and that the US isn't the only one making significant changes to international codes and standards and other aspects of design. So, another way to, that we see this in our classes and is to, perhaps in maybe some things that we're looking to add into our coursework is to discuss projects that are affordable housing projects, and using that as case studies even for our technical coursework. And that's something that the study that I referenced discusses as well. And think about impactful design in the more negative light as well, and the consequences of our design, whether positive or negative. So gentrification and the green spaces that we're incorporating. Noelani's going to talk a little bit about land acknowledgements, and then we're going to wrap up.
Yeah, and so there's been a lot of movement towards doing land acknowledgements in architecture. I know Personally, from studio and some things in tech, there has been a movement towards acknowledging the cultural heritage that has been present before we design on the area or before when looking at where specifically even our school is located, all the cultural heritage of that was present before. And so it's definitely something to integrate into curriculum when understanding that there has been a population before us and a population that is still prevalent in there. And land acknowledgement is one of the steps towards a more inclusive learning curriculum.
Thank you. Let's go to the next slide, and which is just our references. We'd like to thank you all for listening. That concludes the presentation on exclusive practices in our field. So if you'd like to check out any of these references on your own time, we are going to, we have all that information on our information page, which is found in the link tree of our Instagram bio, which Raina will be dropping in the chat. And then let's go to the next slide and start talking about how breakout rooms are going to work. And just as a reminder, if you're not going to stay for breakout rooms, which we really would like for you to, then still fill out the survey, please, because feedback really helps. Alrighty, so so basically we're going to have breakout rooms of about 5 or 6 people each. Each one of of us co-hosts is going to be moderating one of those discussions. So we like to set some little ground rules, which is challenge ourselves to be uncomfortable and be in the space to ask questions and hold discussion. Be here to communicate and learn and understand that we are here to support each other. And engage in discussion by turning on your camera and unmuting yourself if possible and if you're comfortable. We understand that's not an option for everybody, and that is a-okay. Feel free to utilize the chat if that's more comfortable for you, or talk without your camera. We just want to be able to facilitate a profitable discussion. Next slide. These are the discussion questions. You'll be presented with these again in your individual breakout rooms. Again, anything, I don't, maybe not again, I don't think I said it, but anything that you say is going to be anonymous. Each of the moderators, we will be taking notes, but it will not be associated with your name whatsoever. It'll just be to write down any, any good ideas or comments that we can bring to just to our committee in general. So the questions, are you familiar with any of the exclusionary practices that were mentioned in the presentation? Can you think of any visible or possibly invisible exclusionary practices in your city, class, or everyday space? And how can we remediate structural legacies of exclusion and strive for more equitable built environment? So we're going to go ahead and go into breakout rooms.